So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going to be talking about one of the biggest cases in Australian true crime history. I've wanted to cover this case for so long, literally since I started my channel, but I've put it off for so long because I knew it was going to be a long one, and it is a long one. This is actually going to be a two-parter. So this is part one. Part two will be out in the next few days. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you got the bell notification on so you don't miss when I post part two. But before we get into this video, I just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Best Fiends. Best Fiends is a free adventure puzzle game where you get to solve thousands of puzzles and collect a cute little team of mates called Fiends. You guys know me by now. I am absolutely obsessed with mobile games, and Best Fiends is my newest obsession. I'm never off that game. I've actually had it for years. I've played it for years, and recently you just cannot pull me away from that game. I just love the cute little bug characters, man. I love the fiends and even the villains. So the point of the game is that you defeat the slugs, who are supposed to be like the evil villains, but even they're cute, man. I kind of like them. It's a super chill game, so I love to play it when I'm in bed on a night trying to wind down, or if I take a break from my research during the day. Sometimes I take a little bit of a longer break than anticipated because I've got to defeat all the slugs. I even got Editor Jack into playing the game as well, and we're getting really competitive about it. Like, we message each other at least once a day, like, I'm on level 35 now, what are you on? No. Obviously I'm winning. Of course I am. There'll be a link down below in the description to download Best Fiends for free, and if you do go through my link, then you'll get $5 worth of gold and diamonds if you beat level 5. I know you can do it. I know you can beat level 5. Try and beat me. Try and beat me. I think I'm on level 36 at the moment, so try it. Thanks again to Best Fiends for sponsoring this video. Now, before we get into it, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Just a couple of warnings before we get into this case. These warnings do span across part 1 and part 2. I can't remember which part has what kind of content in it, but throughout this case there will be mentions of sexual violence, rather graphic sexual violence as well, very graphic details of injuries, as well as talk of suicidal thoughts at points, and depression and everything that goes along with that. So if that is something that you don't want to hear right now, feel free to click out of this video. I'm sure I can see you again sometime with another case that's probably a bit better fit for you. But all of that being said, let's just get into the case. Anita Lorraine Lynch was a 26-year-old woman born on November 2nd, 1959 to parents Grace and Gary. She was born in Sydney, Australia, but she was actually raised about 40 kilometres away from Sydney in a place called Blacktown. Now, Blacktown did have relatively high crime rates, especially among young people. Things like robberies, theft, burglaries, drug charges, things like that were quite high. But at the same time, it was the kind of stuff where if you just didn't get involved in that lifestyle, then it was unlikely to affect you. It was in the same circles that a lot of this crime was happening. There were nicer parts of Blacktown. So that's the area that we're talking about anyway, and that was the place where Anita Cobby grew up along with her younger sister Catherine. And Catherine was Anita's absolute mini-me. She was Anita but smaller. You know, she copied everything she did. She idolized her older sister. She wanted to be just like Anita. They were very close as they were growing up, and even into adulthood they remained like best friends before they were sisters, you know? They used to go out all the time. They loved going to the city together, shopping. Catherine said that Anita had very expensive taste and she loved to shop with her sister. Anita's family described her as beautiful in mind, body, and soul. She was very compassionate, very caring, very empathetic. One particular thing that her friends said about Anita that really stuck with me was that she was such a good listener. Like, when you were in a conversation with Anita, you knew she was listening and taking in every single word you were saying. She would like lean into the conversation. She would like rest her chin on her hand as you were talking to her. You were all she was focused on in that moment. And I just think that's something so beautiful to be remembered by. Like, something so small but so big at the same time. Like, that tells you a lot about the kind of woman she was. Anita Cobby was very into music. She loved all the kind of typical 80s bands, you know, being a woman in her 20s, in the 80s. She loved it. She loved Eurythmics, The Police. She loved Simply Red, specifically the Simply Red song Holding Back the Years. Her sister-in-law later said that that song was Anita's song. Like, whenever she hears that song out in public, kind of brings a tear to her eye because that was Anita. But one thing Anita was very much known for, and one thing that's talked about a lot in relation to this case, is her looks, her physical looks. She was so stunning. She was beautiful. She was always very well dressed. Her hair was always big and bouncy, these big 80s curls. In her late teens and her early 20s, Anita decided to make the most of the good looks that she was blessed with, and she entered a lot of like beauty pageant type things. She even won like quite a few of them. She was told time and time again that she could get a career in this kind of thing. Like, if she wanted to be a model, she so could. She had the looks, she had just it to be a model. But Anita wasn't that interested in that kind of thing. She wanted to do something with a lot more meaning to her. Like, she was an incredibly kind-hearted, nurturing, compassionate person, and she knew that she wanted a job in that kind of field. She wanted a job where she could help people. She often looked up to her mother, Grace, who was a nurse, and when it eventually came to the point of Anita's life where she was picking a career path, she decided to follow in her mother's footsteps and take up some kind of nurse training. So Anita went off to get a degree, and then she went to work at a hospital to be like a trainee nurse. But along the way, she got swept off her feet by an older man named John Cobby. The two of them met because he was also a trainee nurse at this same hospital that Anita was. He'd been there a couple years longer than she had. He was a few years older than her, a few years deeper into the course. He was 23, she was 20. He was kind of showing her the ropes, and he fell head over heels for Anita. Their personalities contrasted each other quite nicely. Like, Anita was quite a grounding energy for John, and John was kind of all over the place. He was the fun life of the party, and they kind of brought each other to a nice level. He brought Anita up and made her, you know, a bit more confident and lively, and she kept him in check. John Cobby was very much like a class clown type figure. He was always, you know, playing pranks on people. He was mischievous. He was just fun. He was just a fun energy to be around. And he said that when he first saw Anita, he just thought she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He actually had a girlfriend at the time, and he ended up splitting up with his girlfriend because, well, I don't know, because a new girl came to work and he started fancying her. He said he never thought he could get a woman like Anita. Like, she was just way out of his league, and he wasn't good enough for her. He wasn't attractive enough for her. But luckily for him, Anita was the one that made the first move. They kind of bumped into each other in the corridor. She made conversation, and in that moment he thought, oh my god, like, maybe she likes me. So he asked her out for a meal. They went out, they spent hours and hours talking, and then the next night they went out for another meal, and then, you know, they just clicked and they formed this relationship. So he was thinking all of these things about Anita, that she was too good for him, but she was thinking the same thing in her mind. She was thinking, wow, this guy's so like cool and carefree, and he's just fun, and she thought he was so handsome. It was just a beautiful relationship. From what I read about these two, their families said that they just radiated happiness when they were together. So they met and started dating in 1980, and by 1981 they were actually engaged. John Cobby said that he just fell so in love with this woman that he didn't want to do the rest of his life without her. So why not just put a ring on it? In 1982, the couple got married, and Anita Lynch became Anita Cobby. A couple of months into this marriage, Anita fell pregnant. And the two of them were, you know, they were kind of caught off guard by it. It wasn't planned. But at the same time, they were happy. They'd just got married. They were going to start their little family. However, just 9 weeks later, Anita actually miscarried. She lost the baby. And this was a very crushing moment for the two of them. As unexpected as this pregnancy had been, they'd prepared themselves in their brain. They were going to be parents. They were going to have a baby. They were going to start this family. You know, they supported each other through it, and they agreed that when the time was right, they would try again. But for now, they were just going to enjoy their 20s. They weren't going to worry about it too much. In the meantime, the two of them got 2 dogs, and they would take these dogs everywhere. They were literally like their children. They would take them out on boat rides, because the two of them, John and Anita, love to sail boats. At one point, John Cobby actually won a lot of money betting on the horses. And with this money, he decided that he was going to do something for his beautiful wife, Anita. It was Anita's dream to travel the world, to go to loads of different countries, to see loads of different cultures, specifically Rome. She'd always told John that she thought Rome was the most romantic country in the whole world, and he always promised her that when they got a chance, he was going to take her there. So with this money, that's exactly what they did. They went traveling for like a full year. They were happy, they were carefree, they were loving it, and then when they returned from this trip, John approached Anita and he said, look, I think we're ready again now. I think we're ready to try for a baby again and, build up our little family. However, Anita kind of wasn't on that wavelength. At this point in her life, she was just enjoying being young. In her mid-20s, she was carefree, she was meeting her friends, she was traveling, she had no responsibilities and she didn't really feel like getting any responsibilities either. And this, along with some other issues in the relationship, started driving a wedge between John and Anita. Eventually, in 1986, they'd been married almost 3 years, and the two of them decided that they just needed some time apart to figure out what they wanted. They were going to go on a break. They weren't going to break up, they weren't going to divorce, they weren't separated. They just needed some time apart from each other, just because I don't know. We really don't know what was going on in their relationship behind closed doors. All we know is that they kind of wanted different things at this point in their life. Anita wanted to do a lot. Like, she was thinking about taking on another degree. She was thinking about taking like Spanish classes, things like that. Like, she was still in the development stage of her own life. She wasn't ready to have children and settle down and everything yet. So for the time being, Anita moved back to Blacktown from Sydney. So she'd moved to Sydney to work in this hospital with John, and now she was moving back to Blacktown. She was going to move back in with her parents. They were going to have about 6 weeks apart just to clear their heads and kind of work on themselves for a while. She was still working as a nurse, but she was just kind of focusing on her life outside of John. So she was working on her social life. She had a great group of friends, great family life. She was debating picking up a degree in the arts. She signed up for those Spanish classes that she always wanted to sign up for. She enrolled, she paid for them. However, Anita Cobby would never get to go to those Spanish classes. Around 6 weeks into their separation, Anita and John met up once again to kind of discuss what was going on, like where they were going to take this, because they were still married, they just kind of weren't together at that time. They booked a romantic getaway on the coast in order to kind of rekindle their romance, and John said it worked like a charm. He felt like this was their honeymoon all over again. He said Anita told him she loved him so many times on this trip, and he said it back to her every single time. And they even discussed on this trip that when they got home, they were going to start looking for houses to buy and to move in together and start their little family. On February 1st, 1986, it was a Saturday, Anita and John went for dinner at his parents' house, and John's sister was there, and they announced to the family that they were going to go house hunting the following Monday. So in 2 days' time, they were going to go out and find their forever home. The family said that they seemed so excited. They were so ready for this. They were just so happy. They were in love. They were ready for this next step. But Anita would never make those plans to go house hunting. The next day was a Sunday, February 2nd, 1986, and it was the same as any other work day for Anita. She got up, she went for her morning shift at the hospital. It was about an hour-long train journey to Sydney from Blacktown, so she went all the way there, she did her shift, and then at the end she had plans to meet up with some co-workers and go for dinner. So it was 3 of them that went out for this dinner at a local city called Redfern. They had a few bottles of wine, they had a really nice time, and then around 8 p.m, 8:30, they set off back home. One of the friends dropped Anita off at Central Railway Station so that she could catch her train back to Blacktown, which she did. She safely got on her train at that railway station and she arrived at Blacktown train station. But it was there that things didn't go to plan. Usually, when Anita would get off the train in Blacktown, she would go to one of the payphones and she would call her father to come to the station and pick her up and take her back to her parents' house. But when Anita walked over to one of the payphones, it was out of order. Something had happened with like vandalism, and every single payphone in that whole train station was out of use. And this was the 1980s, you know, mobile phones were not a big thing yet. So this was kind of Anita's only way of getting home, was to be able to contact her father. She did walk to the local taxi rank, but there were no taxis available. And so she thought, well, it's not that far. It was about a 2-mile walk, just less than a 2-mile walk. I mean, it was about 10 p.m. now. It was dark. It wasn't safe for her to be walking, but she thought it's not that far. So she just set off. The next morning, Anita's parents woke up and they realised that Anita never came home the night before. Her father checked his phone and saw that he never even got a missed call from her to say that she'd arrived at Blacktown train station, so they just kind of assumed that maybe she never came back to Blacktown. They knew who she was going out with and they knew that they were her co-workers in Sydney. So they thought, well, maybe she just stayed at one of her friends' houses in Sydney. She had her work clothes with her. It kind of made sense. Maybe after a few drinks, she just didn't feel like getting the hour-long train all the way back to Blacktown. So they kind of explained it away in their head. Her parents just went about her day. They weren't too worried. I mean, their daughter was 26 years old. She's a fully grown adult. You know, if she wants to stay over at a friend's house, she doesn't really need to tell her parents. So they went about their day. They weren't too worried until they received a phone call from one of Anita's co-workers, one of those friends that she went out with the night before, asking where she was and if she was okay. As they were talking, both parties in this phone call kind of had this realization that they each thought that Anita was with the other person. Her parents thought she'd stayed with her friends, and her friends obviously thought that she'd got home to her parents because they dropped her off at the train station. And when they realised that no one knew where she was, that was when this panic set in. Anita's father wasted no time reporting her missing. He went straight down to the police station and told them that his daughter hadn't arrived home that night. Meanwhile, her mother stayed at home and she was calling round everyone Anita knew. Literally every single one of her friends, every single one of her co-workers, but none of them had seen Anita. None of them had heard from her. They hadn't got a call or a text. And of course, included in all of these calls that her mother was making was John Cobby, her husband. Obviously, he still lived and worked in Sydney, and he said that he hadn't seen her, hadn't heard from her, she hadn't come to his house, and he was incredibly concerned. So he decided to jump on the train and go down to Blacktown, take that hour-long train so that he could be with Anita's family at this time. But John Cobby didn't have the best relationship with Anita's parents. I don't think they really liked him at this point because the two of them had been arguing a little bit. I mean, at this point they had reconciled and they were looking at getting back together and everything. Obviously they had the honeymoon trip to the coast, so things were looking up. But at the same time, John said that he just got this feeling when he was at their house that he just wasn't welcome there. They just didn't really want him there. John said that he and Anita's father got into a couple of arguments that day, literally the day that Anita went missing, because they both felt like the other person wasn't doing enough. It was like John would ask these questions like, oh, did you call this person? And Gary would be like, of course I have. Like, it's my daughter. I know who her friends are. I've called that person and they don't know where she is. They were both just very stressed. Obviously, this was a very overwhelming, very scary situation and they were just kind of snapping at each other. And so John decided it was probably for the best in order to maintain relationships and cause as little stress as he possibly could at this time. So he decided to go back home to Sydney. So her parents were trying everything they possibly could in Blacktown. John Cobby and Anita's co-workers and friends were trying everything they could in Sydney and they just couldn't find her. They continued all the way into the night and then into the next morning, and still there was no sign of Anita. She hadn't contacted anyone. So this is day 2 that she's been missing at this point, and around 9:30 that morning, police got a call from a local farmer. This farmer had gone out that morning to go and check on his cows, as he did every single day, and he noticed that they were all kind of congregated in one corner of the field, and he thought it was a little bit weird, but you know, cows are cows, so he just kind of left them to it. So he went somewhere else, maybe checked on some other kind of animal, I don't know, and then he came back to the cows and they were all still there, and he thought, well, they must be looking at something. There must be something going on over there. Maybe there was an animal on the floor or something. So he decided to get on his little quad bike and go up and check what was going on with these cows. As he was kind of driving up on this quad bike, he noticed that there was something on the floor in the middle of all the cows. And as he got closer, he noticed that that thing on the floor was a dead human body. It was the body of a woman. She was laying naked, face down in the dirt. And this farmer said that as soon as he saw this body, he just knew that whatever this woman had been through, it must have been a horrific ordeal. Literally, just from the look of her body, she looked tortured. So he called the police. The body was taken for an autopsy, and due to the fact that Anita had been reported missing literally just the day before, police kind of already connected this in their minds. They didn't even need a formal identification. There was only one woman missing in the whole town, and a woman's body had just been found. So they called Anita's family to come down to the police station so that they could show them the jewelry that was found on this woman. There were a couple of rings, especially a ring that kind of looked like a wedding ring. It was very unique. It was like two different bands crossed over. So they called her family down and they showed her this ring. And as soon as John Cobby saw that ring, he just knew that the woman that they'd found, that body that they'd found, it had to be his Anita. Even though they'd separated at the time, she always wore her wedding ring. Through that 6 weeks that they technically weren't together, she wore it non-stop. She never took it off. And even in death, she was wearing it the night that she died. But Anita's sister Catherine saw this ring and she said, hang on, no, that can't be Anita's, because this ring's all rusty and dirty. Anita never let her jewelry get like that. And that was when one of the detectives actually had to step in and say, actually, that's not rust, that's dried blood. And it was when the detective said that her family realized that Anita probably didn't have an easy death. The fact that there was blood on her wedding ring. They were just kind of preparing themselves to hear about the horrific ordeal that she must have been through. So the police were pretty sure that the body that they had was Anita Cobby's. I mean, they'd kind of identified her through jewelry, but at the same time, as much as police didn't want her family to have to see her, they kind of needed them to in order to formally identify her body. John Cobby was originally asked, obviously being her husband, and he said that he just couldn't do it. He just couldn't see his wife like that. He didn't know what had happened to her just yet, but he just knew he couldn't see her dead body. He couldn't see her if she'd had a brutal death. It had just ruined him mentally. And so her parents stood up and they said, well, I guess we're gonna have to do it. And that was when detectives decided to intervene, and they told Grace, Anita's mother, that they were not gonna let her go in there and see her daughter. They said that they just could not let a mother see her child in that way. They just weren't going to allow it. And so that left only Gary. So Anita's father, Gary, walked into this room alone, and he said that as soon as he saw the table in the middle of the room, even the cover was pulled over her. He couldn't even see her yet, but he said that he just felt sick. And when that sheet was pulled back and Gary saw his daughter's lifeless face just laying on this table in front of him, Gary Lynch just collapsed to the ground. Just a warning that the following part of this video will be quite graphic. There'll be a timestamp on screen if you don't want to listen to this, but we will be going into all of the injuries that Anita sustained. So if you don't want to watch that, skip to this time. So it was very clear just from looking at Anita's body that she had been tortured in her final moments. She was brutally beaten. She had two big black swollen eyes. Her nose was broken. Her cheekbones were broken, both of them. She had scrapes and abrasions just all over every single part of her body. Shoulders, arms, legs. Her breasts had quite a few on them. It seemed as though her breasts were specifically targeted. She also had small lacerations, like slash wounds, all over her body. Again, they didn't seem to be like stab wounds. They were more just like whoever had done them to her was just doing it just to hurt her. There were self-defense wounds lining her hands, her arms, her wrists. One of her fingers was like fully cut open all the way down it from where she tried to defend herself from this knife attack. A few of her fingers on that same hand were fractured, and then on her other hand, 3 of her fingers were almost completely severed. This suggested that that maybe she tried to defend herself from this knife attack. Maybe she'd grabbed the knife, or, you know, if a knife was held to her throat, maybe she'd tried to get her fingers behind it and push it away. But in doing that, she almost severed her fingers. One of her ears was completely severed as well. Again, a completely unnecessary injury. It seemed her killer was just doing a lot of things just for the fun of it. She'd clearly been repeatedly violently sexually assaulted and sodomized. Some reports even say that her genitals were slightly mutilated in some kind of way. And these were all just injuries that she'd sustained while she was alive. Anita Cobby's final cause of death was from a huge slash wound to the side of her neck. Her throat had been slit so deeply that Anita Cobby was almost entirely decapitated. One final note in the autopsy was that the coroner noticed that there were already parasites feeding off her body in certain wounds. People that saw Anita's body, so like the farmer and different police officers, coroners, pathologists, they say that when she died, when she was found, her eyes were still open and you could see the look of sheer terror, sheer agony in this woman's eyes. Even after death, the look in her eyes was still there. Gary Lynch took one look at Anita's body on the table and said, "I wish I could say that's not my daughter, but then it would be somebody else's daughter and they'd be going through what I'm going through now." So the body was finally identified as that of 26-year-old Anita Cobby, and police knew now that they had to do everything in their power to solve this murder as fast as they possibly could. Not even just for Anita and her family that had just gone through all of this, but also for every other woman, for every other person in Blacktown, because the person or people that were capable of brutalizing this woman so much, they were still at large. They were still out there. They could strike again. So one of the first things they did was they went back to that farmer that found Anita's body in his field and they questioned him about that night and if he'd seen anything, heard anything. The farmer said that he hadn't seen anything, but thinking back to the night that Anita went missing on the Sunday night, he did recall hearing some female screams in the fields outside of his house. The farmer didn't think too much of it at the time because he actually had quite an issue with teenagers coming around to his fields and using them as just, you know, a place to hang out, I suppose. He said he always just heard people in his fields shouting, screaming, having fun together and stuff, so he just kind of assumed it was that. He never heard the screams and thought someone is being murdered in my field. He just kind of assumed it was kids. So police decided to interview a few of the other people that lived kind of near this farm. There weren't many, but a couple of other people that lived close by said that they also heard a scream on that Sunday night. So it seemed that these screams on the Sunday night were obviously coming from Anita Cobby, which told police that she was still alive when she was brought to that field. They initially thought that maybe her body was just dumped there, maybe this had happened elsewhere, but now it was very clear that a lot of this ordeal probably took place in that field. So was she kidnapped as well? Police had a search around those fields, around the crime scene where the body was found, and they really didn't find anything. There were no leads to go off, there was no weapons, there was nothing that the killer left. They didn't have anything to go off at this point, so police decided to go and speak to those that knew Anita best. You know, her friends, her family, her husband, and they were kind of asking if anyone might want to do this to Anita. Like, was she specifically targeted for any particular reason? At first, they spoke to Gary and Grace Lynch. They were the first people interviewed, and they told the police that Anita had recently split from her husband. Now, in police's eyes, this was a huge red flag. In most murder cases, the first place police look is the partner. It's the husband, it's the wife, it's the boyfriend. And especially when there's a recent separation, you know, could John Cobby have killed his wife out of anger or jealousy? In his first interview with police, John Cobby seemed absolutely devastated. He was in bits as he was identifying that ring. They saw him do that, and he told them that he blamed himself for this. He said he wished he'd been there that night. You know, if he was just with her then none of this would have happened. You know, no one would have come and attacked her. He could have protected her. So he seemed really, really emotional about this whole thing. He seemed absolutely distraught at the loss of his wife. And so police were asking him, you know, the ins and outs of their marriage, why they separated, you know, what was really going on. And eventually they asked him for his alibi on the Sunday night, on the night that Anita disappeared and was probably murdered. He said that on that Sunday night, he was just at home. He'd come home from work in Sydney and he was just at home chilling. And then the following morning, he went back to work at the hospital. And then that evening, he went out with his father, I believe, and his brother. So detectives are already raising an eyebrow at this. Like, he didn't have that solid of an alibi. What do you mean you were just at home by yourself? You know, no one can confirm that. So they were a little bit suspicious at this point. So they kept asking questions, you know, about the split, any arguments leading up to this point. Because police actually knew from other people, from Anita's friends, her co-workers, they knew that he was obsessed with her, to put it bluntly. He always had been, you know, and for the most part, this was in a good way. You know, he was obsessed with his wife. Who doesn't want their partner to be obsessed with them? But towards the end, especially during this split, he would be calling her constantly at work, you know, when she was trying to have dinner with her friends, he'd be texting, calling. He would ask for her back literally like every single day, and she wasn't ready to take him back for a very long time. And here, police saw a motive, you know. If she didn't fully want to get back with him, then maybe his thought process was like, if I can't have you, no one can. The investigation continued until one of the detectives just out and out said it. Did you kill Anita? John Cobby denied it, and he said from that point on, you know, everything was just foggy in his brain. It was like in that moment he just got so overwhelmed that he was being accused of this. It was like his vision was blurry, his head was just spinning, and police were getting more and more frustrated with him. They were saying, you did it, just say you did it. And eventually this interview, this questioning that he was having with police, went into an enhanced interrogation. If you don't know what an enhanced interrogation is, that's where police get physical with the suspect. John Cobby alleges that police began shoving him, like pushing his shoulders back and just saying, just admit you did it, you killed Anita. They're demanding that he answers these questions and he's just not. You know, at this point he's quite out of it. And they're just getting more and more physical with him. They're pushing him against the wall, they're throwing him to the ground, slamming his head back into the wall. And they're saying to him, you killed her, didn't you? Like, they're telling him that he did this. Like, you killed her. You killed your wife. And this wore John down so much, and his mental state was already struggling in this interrogation, and it got to the point where he just looked up at these officers and he said, yeah, I did it, I must have done it. Police had a confession from John Cobby that he had killed his wife. But for some reason, even though this was, you know, exactly what detectives wanted, they were telling him, just confess, you've killed her. You know, they were pulling this out of him for so long. When they eventually got it, they weren't satisfied with the answer. It was almost like they knew they'd forced him into it, and it wasn't genuine, and it wasn't what they wanted. So they went back to the autopsy report to try to, you know, just confirm in their heads that it was John. And as they were reading through all of the autopsy reports and things, they were saying to each other, they were like, man, it can't just be one person. Like, these injuries, they were all very different, and they looked like they were inflicted by different people with different things, you know, different objects, different weapons. There were different techniques. There were, you know, it seemed very clear on this second look at the autopsy report that perhaps Anita Cobby had multiple killers, multiple attackers. There were just little inconsistencies between, you know, John Cobby's life, I suppose. Even though he did seem quite suspicious, didn't have a solid alibi, they didn't think that he killed her anymore. They kind of changed their mind and they were like, never mind, we don't want your confession. And they decided that they hadn't found Anita Cobby's killer yet. And so John Cobby was ruled out as a suspect, even though they wore him down to the point where he gave a false confession. John Cobby, following this, he really mentally struggled in the aftermath of his wife's murder. As I'm sure you can imagine, his life was just never the same again. It was never fully happy again. He'd lost the light of his life, the woman that he saw the rest of his future with. To try to cope with this loss, John began drinking very heavily. He started taking heroin for the first time in his whole life. 3 days after Anita Cobby's body was found, he started injecting heroin. Before long, he'd developed dependencies on these drugs. He was addicted to a lot of things, and it was entirely changing him as a person. Like, he was a completely different guy. His family, his friends, Anita's family, people just didn't recognize the person that he'd become. Even at Anita's funeral, he was so off his face on all these drugs, and he was so drunk that he couldn't even stand up. He was stumbling everywhere. And there was one point at the funeral where John became disruptive, and he started screaming as they were taking Anita's coffin out of the room. He was screaming, saying, "No, don't take her away from me. Don't take her away from me." And it got to the point where 2 grown men, I think his father and someone else, had to physically drag John Cobby out of the funeral hall because he was just so distraught. He was screaming, he was crying. Everyone knew he was intoxicated, and he looks back on that funeral with so much regret. He wished he never acted like that. But at the same time, everyone understood his pain. He had lost his whole future in that woman. John Cobby said that he took the amount of drugs that he did, all of that heroin, all of that alcohol, because he believed at that time he was trying to kill himself. Maybe not directly, but he was just kind of hoping that he would accidentally take too much one day and just not wake up. In his words, he said he was trying to kill himself, but he just didn't have the guts to just do it. So he was just trying to overdose. Meanwhile, police carried on looking into other suspects. At this point, John Cobby completely cleared as a suspect. They were back to square one. They didn't have anyone in particular. So instead, police decided to look into a lot of people that might have a motive or access to Anita that night. So they looked into local sex offenders, people that lived close by the train station and on Anita's route home that she would have walked that night, people that had a history of sex crimes or violent crimes against women. They looked into a few people, but eventually ruled them out. You know, there was no one too promising. They interviewed pretty much every single taxi driver in the whole area, especially that taxi rank that was close by the train station, because if she was to get a taxi, it would have been one of those. Every single one brought into the station, interviewed, every single one let go. None of them was suspicious. And it was at this point that one of the police officers remembered a phone call that they'd taken on the night that Anita disappeared. Of course, when they took this phone call, Anita hadn't yet been reported missing, so they were never connected until this point. But this call was made from literally 2 streets away from Blacktown train station. So now this guy was starting to think, oh God, these are connected. A teenage boy and his mother had been sat at home that night on the night that Anita disappeared. They were just watching TV in the living room when they heard a woman's scream coming from outside the home. And this was a long scream as well. The boy said it was like at least 30 seconds long. So he knew immediately that this was a terrified scream. This woman was trying to make noise. It wasn't just a playful scream. It wasn't just teenagers out on the street. This was a woman in sheer terror. It was around 9:45 p.m. The boy heard this scream, looked at his mother, said, "What the hell was that?" And as he's looking at his mother, the scream's continuing, and in his brain he's thinking, I've got to go and see what this is. So he ran straight outside the front door, ran to the end of his garden, and there he saw a car. This car had its lights off. It was kind of parked on the side of the street, and as soon as he got there, this car did a huge U-turn and drove down the street kind of towards him. Even when it started driving, the car never turned its lights on, and immediately this guy thought, that's very weird. Bear in mind it was dark. It was now nighttime, obviously nearly 10 p.m. No normal driver would drive around in the dark without their lights on. This car was trying to hide itself. As the car drove by him, he noticed inside there were a group of boys. There was particularly one in the back seat that locked eyes with this teenage boy and stared at him the whole way the car was going down the street. Like, from there, he was looking at him as he went past, and then when the car carried on down the street, this guy turned his head to look behind him and keep an eye on this teenage boy. And the boy noticed something quite odd about this guy that was sat in the back. He was ducking his head. Like, he was sat quite high in the chair, and it was like his head was touching the ceiling, so he had to duck it. It seemed as though this guy was sat on something. in the back seat, sat on something that was pushing him higher, that meant he didn't kind of fit in the car anymore. And when paired with the woman's scream that led him outside in the first place, this boy feared that he might have just witnessed a kidnapping. In that exact moment, this boy's neighbour arrived home in his car, and he jumped in his neighbour's car and he said, right, I know you've just come home, but follow that car. They drove to the end of the road to try and chase after this car, but when they got there, they'd already lost them. So these two men, they just decided to drive around for another 10, 15, 20 minutes just to see if they could see that car anywhere. This boy that had witnessed it, he had the image of that car imprinted in his brain. He would know that car if he saw it. They were driving around for a while. They didn't see anything until they got onto this kind of country farm lane, and there the boy saw the car. The car that he'd just seen these guys kidnap this woman in. So the men got out of their car to go and investigate this car that they thought was the kidnapping car. They grabbed a flashlight, they went over and they shone it inside, and there was nothing in there. There was no one in there, nothing seemed amiss, and they just thought, oh well, maybe it's just a different car, I don't know. Just to make sure, they took their flashlights and they shone them in the surrounding fields to see if anyone was in there, if anything was going on. But they didn't see or hear anything, so they just got back in their car and they drove back home. So this guy called the police about what he'd seen, and now about 3, 4, 5 days into the Anita Cobby investigation, police called him back into the station to talk about that thing that he witnessed. He said he couldn't really describe the men in the car because it was very dark. The only reason he could see that the guy in the back was looking at him was because they drove underneath a streetlight and it lit this guy's face up, so he could see that his eyes were looking at him, but he couldn't so much remember what the guy looked like. But the boy did describe the car to the police that he'd seen these men driving in, so at least they had a little bit of a lead to go off. So police went and conducted interviews all up and down that street of all the other neighbours to see if anyone else might have seen or heard this car and this group of men, and other people actually had. Another 2 people, 2 teenagers, 2 siblings, had also witnessed what they believed to be the kidnapping. But they'd actually caught this incident sooner than the other guy had, so they'd actually seen part of the actual kidnapping. They said they saw these men bundling a dark-haired woman into the back of that car. So now police were pretty sure that this was Anita Cobby's kidnapping that these people had witnessed. And this was, you know, a huge revelation in this case. So they started working with these witnesses, interviewing them and kind of getting as much information as they possibly could, because now they could pinpoint where this had happened and potentially who had done it. And that is where I'm gonna leave part 1 of this case. Thank you for watching. Part 2 will be out in like 2 days. Promise. Make sure you're subscribed with my notifications on because you don't want to miss when I post part 2. Thanks again to Best Fiends for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you want to download the game for free, you can do so using the link down below in my description. And if you do download through my link, you'll get $5 worth of gold and diamonds for free if you pass level 5. I know you can do it. Come on, try and beat me. Huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below. That really helps me out. If you want to subscribe, you can click this link right here. Make sure you do so you don't miss part 2. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, the link to do so is right here. And if you want to watch another true crime video, there'll be a playlist on screen right now. Bye!